The morning sun peeked through the blinds of Captain James Reynolds's hotel room, casting long shadows across the floor. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at his watch. 4:30 a.m., another early start. After 15 years as an airline captain, the pre-dawn wake-ups never got easier, but the job still gave him the same thrill it always had. James swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his phone. 3 messages from dispatch. He scrolled through them quickly. Weather delays in Denver, staff shortages in Atlanta, and a notification about a last-minute VIP passenger on his Chicago to San Francisco flight today. He sighed. The airline had been pushing their premium passenger experience lately, which usually meant extra work for the flight. Crew with little support from management. Just what I need, he muttered to himself as he headed for the shower. By the time James arrived at O'Hare International Airport, dark clouds had gathered overhead, promising rain. The terminal buzzed with the usual morning rush. Business travelers clutching coffee cups, families corralling sleepy children, and gate agents trying to maintain order amid the chaos. James strode through the crew entrance, his uniform crisp despite the humidity. He nodded to the security guard, a friendly older man named Pete who'd been working the same post for as long as James could remember. "Morning, Captain. Looks like you might be in for some bumpy skies today," Pete said, gesturing toward the windows. "Story of my life lately, Pete," James replied with a tired smile. The whole month's been nothing but turbulence one way or another, and it had been. 3 delayed flights last week alone, a cabin pressure issue that forced them to return to the gate on Tuesday, and now the endless stream of memos from the new management team about improving efficiency while cutting costs. The airline business had changed since he'd started, and not for the better. In the crew room, James found his first officer, Tom Chen, already reviewing the flight plan. "Morning, Tom. You're eager today," James said, pouring himself a cup of coffee that had probably been sitting there since midnight. Tom looked up from his tablet. "Just trying to get ahead of things. Dispatch says we've got some weather to navigate around. Plus they added 20 more passengers to the manifest last night. We're at full capacity," James groaned. "Perfect. Nothing like sardine can conditions to start the week." He took a sip of the bitter coffee and grimaced. "Let's get through the briefing and head to the aircraft. I want to do a thorough pre-flight today." The 2 pilots went through their usual routine, checking weather reports, fuel calculations, and the maintenance log. Everything looked normal, except for the weather system moving in from the west. They'd need to adjust their route slightly, but nothing too concerning. By the time they reached the aircraft, the ground crew was already loading luggage. Flight attendants arrived shortly after, led by their chief, Sofia Rodriguez, a veteran with nearly 20 years of experience. "Morning, gentlemen," Sofia greeted them with her usual warmth. "Full flight today, and they've added an extra service for the premium cabins because of some bigwig in first class." James fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Any idea who the VIP is?" Sofia shrugged. "Some corporate type, I guess." Dispatch didn't give details, just said to ensure exceptional service. Whatever that means. "It means more work for no extra pay," James muttered. "Let's just get through the pre-flight checks." While Tom handled the exterior inspection, James settled into his seat in the cockpit, running through his portion of the checklist. He tested each switch and dial with practiced precision, his mind drifting occasionally to the mounting pressures at home. His daughter's college tuition was due soon, and the roof needed repairs before winter. The airline's latest contract negotiations weren't going well, with talks of possible pay cuts looming on the horizon. He was pulled from his thoughts by Tom's return to the cockpit. "Everything looks good outside, Captain. Ground crew reports all luggage is loaded and we're fueled according to plan." James nodded. "Good. Let's finish up here and prepare for boarding." 30 minutes later, the boarding process began. James could hear the muffled announcements from the gate agent and the steadily increasing noise as passengers filed onto the aircraft. He used this time to complete his paperwork and review the final weather updates. A knock on the cockpit door interrupted his concentration. Sofia poked her head in. "Just wanted to give you a heads up, Captain. We've got a bit of a situation with a passenger in 3A. She's having trouble with her carry-on and she seems difficult." James frowned. "What kind of difficult?" "The entitled kind," Sofia replied with a knowing look. "Designer clothes, barely looking up from her phone, ignoring instructions. You know the type." James did know the type. After thousands of flights, he'd seen every kind of passenger behavior imaginable. The self-important business travelers were among his least favorite, people who treated the cabin crew like personal servants and acted as if the safety rules were mere suggestions. "Let me know if it escalates," he said. "I don't want any delays today." Sophia nodded and returned to the cabin. James tried to refocus on his work, but he could hear raised voices outside the cockpit. With a sigh, he set down his pen and decided to take a look for himself. In the first-class cabin, a young woman with dark hair was struggling with a large carry-on bag. She seemed to be trying to force it into the overhead bin despite it clearly being too large. A flight attendant was attempting to help, but the woman kept waving her away. The scene triggered something in James. Maybe it was the cumulative stress of the past weeks, or maybe it was seeing yet another example of the entitlement he'd grown to resent. Either way, he felt his patience snap. He approached the situation, standing tall in his captain's uniform. The nearby passengers fell silent, sensing the authority of his presence. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying through the quiet cabin. The young woman looked up, momentarily startled. She opened her mouth to speak, but James continued before she could respond. "Ma'am, if the bag doesn't fit, it needs to be checked. Those are the rules, and they apply to everyone on this aircraft." The woman gestured toward her wrist, saying something James couldn't quite hear. Her face flushed with embarrassment as all eyes in the cabin turned toward them. Instead of waiting for her explanation, James made a decision that would later prove to be a serious misjudgment. He walked to the front of the cabin and picked up the PA microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 1482 to San Francisco. We're almost ready for departure, but we're experiencing a slight delay due to a passenger who seems to think the rules don't apply to her. The lady in 3A needs to understand that safety regulations are in place for everyone's protection, not just for those who choose to follow them." A deathly silence fell over the cabin. The woman in 3A froze, her face now bright red with humiliation. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with both her and the captain. Sophia rushed forward, her eyes wide with disbelief at James's unusual public call-out. In 15 years of flying together, she'd never seen him address a passenger this way. "Captain," she whispered urgently, "I can handle this." "There's no need for—" "It's been handled," James cut her off, handing back the microphone. He turned to the still frozen passenger. "Your bag will be checked and returned to you in San Francisco. Now please take your seat so we can depart." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode back to the cockpit, convinced he'd done the right thing by enforcing the rules. Little did he know that his moment of frustration would set in motion events that would change the course of his career. Back in the cockpit, Tom gave him a questioning look. "Everything okay out there?" James adjusted his seat and reached for his headset. Just another entitled passenger who needed a reality check. Nothing to worry about. But as he began the pre-takeoff procedures, a nagging feeling settled in his stomach. Had he overreacted? The woman had tried to say something about her wrist. Had she been injured? He pushed the thoughts aside. He had an aircraft to fly and 183 passengers depending on him to get them safely to San Francisco. As they taxied toward the runway, rain began to streak across the windshield. The weather was worsening, matching the storm that would soon engulf Captain James Reynolds' professional life, all because of a passenger whose identity would leave him stunned and remorseful. What James didn't know as they lifted into the cloudy Chicago sky was that the woman in seat 3A wasn't just any passenger, and his public embarrassment of her would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Flight 1482 climbed steadily through the clouds, leaving the Chicago skyline behind. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated as the aircraft encountered patches of turbulence, a physical manifestation of the tension that now filled the cabin. In the cockpit, Captain James Reynolds focused on navigating around the weather system that dispatch had warned them about. His hands moved automatically across the controls, muscle memory from thousands of similar flights taking over, while his mind kept returning to the incident before takeoff. "Weather radar shows we've got about 20 more minutes of rough air," Tom said, adjusting the throttle slightly. "Then we should break through into clearer skies." James nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Let's take it up another 2,000 feet, see if we can find smoother air." As the aircraft climbed higher, James couldn't shake the image of the woman's face in seat 3A. her expression of shock and humiliation when he'd called her out over the PA system. In 15 years as captain, he'd never done anything like that before. He'd always prided himself on his professionalism, on handling difficult situations with calm authority. "You seem distracted," Tom commented after several minutes of silence. "Everything okay?" James sighed. "Just thinking about that passenger. Maybe I was too harsh." Tom kept his eyes on the instruments. "It's been a rough few weeks. We're all feeling the pressure." "Still," James replied, "that's no excuse for unprofessional behavior." The interphone buzzed, and James picked it up. It was Sophia from the cabin. "Captain, the service is about to begin. Do you and First Officer Chen want your usual coffee?" "Yes, thanks, Sophia. And how's everything back there? Any issues with the passengers?" There was a brief pause before Sophia answered. "Everything's under control. The woman in 3A hasn't said much since takeoff. She's just been writing in a notebook." After hanging up, James tried to focus on the flight path, but guilt continued to gnaw at him. Perhaps once they landed in San Francisco, he would find the passenger and apologize. It was the right thing to do, regardless of how entitled she might have seemed. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, the woman in seat 3A sat quietly by the window, occasionally jotting notes in a leather-bound journal. Her name was Elena Martinez, though no one on the flight knew that yet. She rubbed her bandaged wrist absently, still sore from a recent injury that had made handling her carry-on difficult, a detail the captain had never allowed her to explain. Elena wasn't the entitled businesswoman the crew had assumed she was. In fact, she'd spent the previous decade as a flight systems engineer for NASA, before accepting her new position as vice president of operations for the very airline she was now flying with. Today was supposed to be part of her informal assessment of the airline's operations, experiencing the service as a regular passenger before officially starting next week. So far, it hadn't gone well. Sophia approached with the beverage cart, offering a practiced smile. "Would you care for a drink?" Elena looked up from her notebook. "Just water, please." As Sophia poured the water, she noticed the professional aviation manuals peeking out of Elena's bag. Her curiosity piqued, she decided to make conversation. "Those look interesting," Sophia said, nodding toward the manuals. "Are you in the industry?" Elena hesitated before answering. "Yes, I've worked in aviation for quite some time." "Pilot?" "Engineer, actually. Flight systems," Sophia's eyebrows raised slightly. "That sounds fascinating. Is that what you're taking notes on?" "The flight?" Elena closed her notebook. "Just some observations." She took a sip of water, wincing slightly as her injured wrist twisted. Noticing the bandage, Sophia's expression softened. "I'm sorry about what happened earlier with your bag. If I'd realized your wrist was injured." "It's fine," Elena said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I should have mentioned it sooner. And the captain? He's not usually like that. He's actually one of our best." Elena gave a non-committal nod and turned toward the window. The conversation was clearly over. As Sophia moved on with the service, she couldn't help but feel there was something different about this passenger. She wasn't displaying the typical behavior of an angry customer. Instead, she seemed to be observing everything with a critical, professional eye. It made Sophia uneasy. When she returned to the galley, the other flight attendant, Lily, was preparing the meal service. "What's the deal with 3A?" Lily asked quietly. "Is she still upset about the captain's announcement?" Sophia began arranging trays. "I'm not sure, but something feels off. She's got aviation manuals with her, and she's taking notes on everything. She mentioned being a flight systems engineer." Lily's eyes widened. "You think she could be from corporate? I heard they were sending people on flights to evaluate service." "I don't know. Maybe we should give the captain a heads up." Lily shook her head. "Let's not bother him with speculation. Besides, if she is from corporate, the damage is already done with that PA announcement." Back in the cockpit, the aircraft had finally reached smoother air. James switched off the seatbelt sign and made a brief announcement to the passengers. His voice was noticeably more subdued than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 38,000 feet and have left the turbulence behind. You're free to move about the cabin, though we always recommend keeping your seatbelt fastened when seated. Our flight time to San Francisco remains approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes. The weather at our destination is currently sunny with a temperature of 68 degrees. Thank you for flying with us today." He placed the microphone back in its holder and leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. The headache that had been threatening all morning was now in full force. "I'll take over for a bit if you want to close your eyes," Tom offered. "You look like you could use a break." James nodded gratefully. "Just for 15 minutes, thanks, but rest wouldn't come." Every time James closed his eyes, he saw the face of the woman he'd humiliated. What had begun as a minor incident now felt like a significant lapse in judgment, one that might have consequences beyond this flight. An hour into the flight, Sophia brought their coffee to the cockpit. James noticed her concerned expression immediately. "Something wrong?" he asked. Sophia hesitated. "Probably nothing, but that passenger in 3A. I think she might be someone important." James felt his stomach tighten. "What makes you say that?" "She has aviation manuals with her. She mentioned being a flight systems engineer, and she's taking detailed notes on everything. The service, the announcements, even the turbulence responses." Tom and James exchanged a glance. "Could be a blogger," Tom suggested. "There are lots of aviation enthusiasts who review flights online." "Or she could be from the FAA," James said quietly, voicing his growing fear. "Either way, I really stepped in it, didn't I?" Sophia gave him a sympathetic look. She hurt her wrist recently. That's why she was struggling with her bag. The information hit James like a physical blow. He jumped to conclusions, made assumptions about a passenger without knowing the full story, and then publicly embarrassed her. It went against everything he believed about being a good captain. "I need to apologize to her before we land," he said firmly. Sophia shook her head. "Maybe wait until after the flight. She doesn't seem to want attention right now." James reluctantly agreed, though the weight of his mistake felt heavier by the minute. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. Elena continued her quiet observation, filling pages of her notebook with notes only she could decipher. The meal service came and went. The flight attendants maintained their professional demeanor, despite the undercurrent of tension. As they began their descent into San Francisco, James made one final announcement, his voice carefully neutral. The usual pre-landing procedures followed: seats upright, tray tables stowed, cabin secured for arrival. When they touched down at SFO, right on schedule despite the weather delays in Chicago, a collective sense of relief spread through the aircraft. James taxied to the gate with his usual precision, bringing the massive machine to a gentle stop. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco International Airport. Local time is 11:42 a.m., and the temperature is 70 degrees with clear skies. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for flying with us today." As passengers began to gather their belongings, James completed the shutdown checklist with Tom. He'd decided to wait by the boarding door to speak with the woman from 3A as she deplaned. It was the least he could do. But before he could leave the cockpit, his company phone buzzed with a message. He glanced down at the screen and felt his blood run cold. "Captain Reynolds, please report to the chief pilot's office immediately upon arrival. Do not leave the airport." Tom noticed his expression change. "What is it?" James handed him the phone, his mouth suddenly dry. "Looks like our mystery passenger made a complaint." And it went straight to the top. What James didn't realize as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions was that the woman he'd embarrassed wasn't merely filing a complaint. She was about to change his entire career in ways he could never have imagined. James stood in the jet bridge as passengers filed past him. He nodded politely, offering the automatic "thank you for flying with us" that had become second nature over the years. His eyes scanned each face, looking for the woman from seat 3A. But somehow he'd missed her in the stream of deplaning passengers. "Did you see where she went?" he asked Sophia, who was standing by the aircraft door. "She was one of the first off," Sophia replied. "Moved pretty quickly once we reached the gate." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been called to the chief pilot's office immediately." Sophia's expression turned sympathetic. Maybe it's not about her. Could be something else entirely. They both knew it wasn't something else. The timing was too perfect, the urgency too clear. Whatever was waiting for James in the chief pilot's office, it wasn't good news. "I'd better get going," James said, checking his watch. "Can you handle the post-flight checks with Tom?" "Of course." "Good luck, Captain." The walk through the terminal felt longer than usual. Normally, James enjoyed the brief connection with the ground world between flights. The bustling energy of the airport, the coffee shops, the reunions happening all around him. Today, he noticed none of it. His mind was consumed with what awaited him. In his 15 years as captain, he'd never been summoned like this. He'd had his share of difficult conversations with management, sure. Every pilot did. But those were scheduled meetings, not urgent summons immediately after landing. The chief pilot's office was located in a separate building near the maintenance hangar. By the time James arrived, his uniform shirt was damp with nervous sweat despite the cool San Francisco air. The receptionist looked up as he entered. "Captain Reynolds? They're waiting for you in conference room 3. They?" James felt his stomach drop. A meeting with multiple people was never a good sign. Conference room 3 was at the end of the hallway. James paused outside the door, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," called a voice he recognized as belonging to Robert Walsh, the chief pilot. James opened the door to find not just Robert, but also Patricia Henderson, the airline's HR director, and a face he didn't recognize, the woman from seat 3A. She was dressed differently now, in a sharp business suit rather than the casual clothes she'd worn on the flight. A leather portfolio sat on the table in front of her, alongside a stack of what appeared to be personnel files. "Captain Reynolds," Robert said, his tone carefully neutral. "Please have a seat." James sat across from the three of them, feeling like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. The woman from 3A met his gaze steadily, her expression professional and unreadable. "I believe you've encountered Dr. Elena Martinez already," Robert continued, with a slight emphasis on the word encountered that made James wince internally. Dr. Martinez. So she had a PhD. James felt even worse about his assumptions. "Captain Reynolds," Patricia from HR cut in. "Do you understand why you're here?"
James nodded slowly.
"I behaved unprofessionally toward a passenger on today's flight. I made assumptions that were incorrect, and I handled the situation poorly. I was coming to apologize to Dr. Martinez when I received your message." Elena raised an eyebrow slightly, the first change in her expression since he'd entered the room. "Well, that's a start," Robert said. "But there's more to this situation than you realize." He turned to Elena. "Dr. Martinez, perhaps you should explain." Elena opened her portfolio and removed a business card, sliding it across the table to James. He picked it up and felt his blood run cold as he read the title beneath her name. Dr. Elena Martinez Weiss, President of Operations, Air National Airlines. James stared at the card, then back at Elena, his mind racing to process this new information. The woman he'd publicly humiliated wasn't just any passenger. She was the new VP of Operations, his boss. "Several times removed, he began, but Elena held up a hand. "Before you say anything else, Captain Reynolds, I think we should clarify the situation." Her voice was calm and measured, with none of the anger he had expected. "I was on your flight today as part of my initial assessment of our airline's operations. I'm officially starting in my role next week, and I wanted to experience our service as a regular passenger first." James felt the room spinning slightly. This was worse than he'd imagined. "The incident with my bag was unfortunate," Elena continued. "I recently injured my wrist rock climbing." She gestured to the bandage James had failed to notice earlier. "I was having trouble managing my carry-on because of the pain, not because I felt entitled to special treatment or was ignoring your crew's instructions." James swallowed hard. "Dr. Martinez, I cannot apologize enough for my behavior. It was completely unprofessional and unjustified." "Yes, it was," she agreed, "but without malice. However, that's not the only reason we're here." Robert cleared his throat. "Elena, Dr. Martinez has been reviewing our operational procedures and passenger experience as part of her new role. Your incident has highlighted some systemic issues we need to address." Patricia from HR opened a folder. "Captain Reynolds, your personnel file shows an exemplary record up until the past 6 months. Recently, however, there have been several notes about increased tension, shorter patience with crew members, and today's incident with a passenger. We're concerned about the pattern." James felt a wave of defensiveness rise up, but he pushed it back down. They were right. His behavior had been changing, and today's incident was just the most visible manifestation of a growing problem. The pressure has been intense lately, he admitted. Budget cuts, schedule changes, the contract negotiations. I've let it affect my performance, and that's unacceptable. Elena watched him carefully, her eyes analytical but not unkind. Captain, the airline industry is always under pressure. What's changed for you personally? The question caught James off guard. He hadn't expected such a direct inquiry into his personal life, especially from someone he'd just insulted. But her tone suggested genuine concern rather than an attempt to gather ammunition against him. My daughter started college this year, he said after a moment. The tuition payments have been challenging, and my wife's mother was diagnosed with cancer last spring. She's been traveling back and forth to help with care, which means I'm handling more at home when I'm not flying. It's not an excuse for my behavior, just the reality. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty. She turned to Robert and Patricia. Could you give us a few minutes alone, please? The request surprised everyone in the room, James most of all. Robert and Patricia exchanged glances before standing up. We'll be right outside if you need us, Robert said, closing the door behind them. For a moment, silence filled the room. James waited, unsure what to expect. Termination? A formal reprimand? Whatever it was, he deserved it. Captain Reynolds, Elena finally said, leaning forward slightly, I'd like to speak frankly with you. Of course, James replied, bracing himself. What you did today was completely unacceptable. You used your position of authority to publicly embarrass a passenger, based on assumptions that were not only incorrect, but revealed a concerning bias. In many scenarios, that would be grounds for immediate termination. James nodded, accepting the assessment. I understand. However, Elena continued, surprising him. I've also spent the flight observing your overall management of the aircraft and crew. Apart from the incident with me, you run a tight operation. Your safety protocols were followed precisely. Your communication with air traffic control was clear and professional. And according to your file, you've had an outstanding record for most of your career. She paused, studying his face. People make mistakes, Captain Reynolds. Even good people, even experienced captains. The question is whether they learn from those mistakes. I've certainly learned from this one, James said quietly. Elena tapped her pen against her portfolio thoughtfully. Here's what I propose. Instead of termination, you'll be placed on a 2-week administrative leave, during which time you'll complete our new professional conduct training program. Upon successful completion, you'll be evaluated before returning to active flying status. It was far more lenient than James had expected. Thank you, Dr. Martinez, that's more than fair. I'm not finished, she said. Additionally, once you return, I'd like you to help develop an improved training module on passenger communication and conflict resolution for all our flight crews, based on what you've learned from this experience. Your mistake could become a valuable teaching tool for others. James blinked in surprise. You want me to help with training? Elena nodded. Sometimes the best insights come from those who have made mistakes and learned from them. Your perspective could be valuable if you're willing to be honest about what happened and why. For the first time since entering the room, James felt a small spark of hope. Not only was he not being fired, but he was being offered a chance to turn his mistake into something constructive. I'd be honored to help, he said sincerely. And Dr. Martinez, I truly am sorry for how I treated you. There's no excuse for it. Elena stood up, extending her hand across the table. Apology accepted, Captain Reynolds. Now let's see if we can use this unfortunate incident to make things better for everyone at Air National. As James shook her hand, he marveled at the turn of events. The woman he'd humiliated had every right to demand his termination. Instead, she was offering him a path to redemption. What he didn't know yet was that this moment would mark the beginning of a professional relationship that would transform not just his career, but the entire airline's approach to customer service. The 2 weeks of administrative leave felt both endless and too brief to James. He spent the first few days at home, the weight of shame and embarrassment heavy on his shoulders. His wife Laura listened patiently as he explained what had happened on the flight and in the meeting afterward. So you humiliated your new boss before you even knew she was your boss? Laura asked, trying to hide her smile. That's quite an achievement, even for you. James groaned. Not funny, I could have lost my job. Laura's expression softened. But you didn't. And from what you've told me about this Dr. Martinez, she sounds like someone who values growth over punishment. That's rare in corporate America. He nodded, thinking about Elena's unexpected approach to the situation. She said my mistake could become a teaching tool. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I start the professional conduct training tomorrow. The training program was held at the airline's corporate headquarters, a sleek glass building in downtown San Francisco. James had expected to join a group of other employees, perhaps pilots who had similarly crossed lines. Instead, he found himself in a small conference room with only two other people, a human resources facilitator named David and a behavioral psychologist, Dr. Wong. Captain Reynolds, David greeted him. Welcome to our professional conduct intervention program. This is a new approach we're implementing under Dr. Martinez's direction. James took a seat, feeling oddly like a test subject. I thought this would be a larger group. Dr. Wong smiled reassuringly. This program is tailored to the individual. We're not interested in generic sensitivity training that treats everyone the same. We want to understand the specific factors that contributed to your situation and address them directly. Over the next several days, James participated in surprisingly insightful discussions about stress management, communication under pressure, and the dangers of making assumptions. Rather than being lectured about what he'd done wrong, he was encouraged to analyze his own behavior and identify the triggers that had led to his unprofessional conduct. Let's talk about that morning, Dr. Wong suggested during their third session. Before you even met Dr. Martinez, what was your state of mind? James thought back to the hotel room, the early wake-up, the messages from dispatch. I was already stressed. Financial worries at home, pressure from management about cost-cutting measures, fatigue from a difficult schedule the week before. So you were primed for conflict before anything actually happened, Dr. Wong observed. The incident with the bag was just the match that lit the fuse. James had never thought about it that way before. I guess I was looking for someone to blame for how I was feeling. And you found a convenient target, David added without judgment. A woman who couldn't defend herself because of her injured wrist in my position of authority. James finished, the realization making him wince. By the end of the first week, James had begun to see patterns in his behavior that stretched back much further than the incident with Elena. The recent stresses had merely exposed cracks that were already there. His tendency to make quick judgments, his growing resentment toward passengers he perceived as entitled, his difficulty separating personal stress from professional responsibilities. During the second week, the focus shifted from analysis to action. James worked with Dr. Wong to develop specific strategies for managing stress and maintaining professionalism, even in difficult situations. They role-played challenging scenarios, with David playing the part of difficult passengers or crew members. On the final day, Elena Martinez herself joined the session. James felt a rush of nervousness when she walked in, but her demeanor was professional and approachable. I wanted to check in on your progress personally, she explained, taking a seat across from him. Dr. Wong has kept me updated, but I'd like to hear your perspective on what you've learned. James took a deep breath. I've learned that what happened on that flight wasn't really about you at all. It was about me, my stress, my assumptions, my failure to maintain professional boundaries between my personal struggles and my responsibilities as captain. Elena nodded encouragingly. And if you encountered a similar situation tomorrow? I'd recognize the signs of my own stress earlier, James replied. I'd take a moment to breathe before reacting. I'd ask questions rather than making assumptions. And I'd remember that my position gives me power over others, which comes with the responsibility to use that power fairly. A slight smile crossed Elena's face. That's a good start. And what about the training module you'll be helping to develop? Any thoughts on that? Actually, yes. James straightened in his chair, feeling a spark of enthusiasm for the first time in weeks. I've been thinking that we could create something based on real scenarios from our airline's history, not just my incident, but others where communication broke down or assumptions led to problems. Elena looked intrigued. Go on. We could film reenactments of these scenarios showing both how they actually played out and how they could have been handled better. Real examples are more powerful than hypothetical ones. They show that we're willing to learn from our mistakes. I like that approach, Elena said. It's honest, which makes it credible, and credibility is essential for training to be effective. She turned to Dr. Wong and David. What do you think? Is Captain Reynolds ready to return to duty? They both nodded. His engagement with the program has been exemplary, Dr. Wong confirmed. I believe he's genuinely integrated what he's learned. Good. Elena stood and extended her hand to James. Then effective Monday, you're cleared to return to the flight schedule. And I'd like you to start working with our training department on that module you described. 2 days a week between flights. James shook her hand, feeling a mix of relief and determination. Thank you for the second chance, Dr. Martinez. Don't thank me yet, she replied with a hint of a smile. The real test comes when you're back in that captain's seat. The following Monday, James arrived at the airport for his first flight since the incident. He felt strange walking through the terminal in his uniform again, both familiar and new at the same time. In the crew room, he found Tom reviewing the flight plan. Welcome back, Captain, Tom said, genuine warmth in his voice. How was your vacation? It wasn't a vacation, of course, but James appreciated Tom's discretion. Enlightening, he replied simply. Ready for Chicago? Weather looks good all the way, Tom confirmed, and Sophia's leading the cabin crew today. James nodded, pleased to have familiar faces around him for his return. As they walked to the aircraft, Tom lowered his voice. Everyone knows what happened, by the way. Word travels fast, but you've got a lot of support out there. People know you're a good captain who had a bad day. Thanks, Tom. That means a lot. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't coming back to judgment, but to understanding. Pre-flight checks proceeded smoothly. James found himself hyper-aware of his tone as he interacted with the ground crew and flight attendants, careful to be thorough without being abrupt. When Sophia arrived with her cabin crew, she gave him a warm hug. Good to have you back, she said. We missed you. As passengers began boarding, James stood at the cockpit door, greeting people as they found their seats. He made a point of noticing details he might have overlooked before. An elderly man, moving slowly down the aisle, a mother juggling a baby and a diaper bag, a young man who seemed nervous about flying. When everyone was seated, James picked up the PA microphone for his welcome announcement. He felt a momentary flash of his last announcement on that fateful Chicago flight, but he pushed it aside. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Reynolds. On behalf of our entire crew, welcome aboard Flight 872 to Chicago. We're looking forward to a smooth flight today, with clear skies most of the way and an on-time arrival expected. My first officer, Tom Chen, and I have over 30 years of flying experience between us, and we're committed to making your journey as comfortable and safe as possible. If there's anything our cabin crew can do to assist you today, please don't hesitate to ask. We're here for you. We should be ready for pushback in about 10 minutes. As he replaced the microphone, James caught Sophia's approving smile. It was a small thing, just a standard welcome announcement, but he'd made a conscious effort to set a different tone. Not just professional, but caring. The flight to Chicago was indeed smooth, both literally and figuratively. James found himself more aware of his interactions with everyone, more present, more thoughtful. When they landed at O'Hare and passengers deplaned, he stood at the door thanking them personally. As the last passenger left, Sophia approached him. Nice work today, Captain. You seem different. James smiled. I am different, or trying to be anyway. What James didn't know as he completed his post-flight checks was that Elena Martinez had been monitoring his return flight remotely, and she was already planning the next phase of both his redemption and the airline's transformation. 6 months had passed since that fateful Chicago to San Francisco flight. The seasons had changed, summer giving way to fall, and then winter. Now, as spring began to emerge, James Reynolds found himself standing in a conference room at airline headquarters, facing a very different situation than the last time he'd been there. You ready for this? Elena Martinez asked, arranging the last chairs in the room. She'd dropped the formal doctor title with him months ago, as their professional relationship had evolved from disciplinary to collaborative. As ready as I'll ever be, James replied, adjusting his tie nervously. He was dressed in his captain's uniform, but today he wasn't flying anywhere. Instead, he was about to present the new crew training program. He'd helped develop a comprehensive approach to passenger interaction and conflict resolution that had grown from the seed of his own mistake. The door opened, and Robert Walsh, the chief pilot, entered with a group of senior captains and training personnel. "Quite a turnout," he commented to James and Elena. "Word has spread about this program. People are curious," James nodded, swallowing hard. Everyone in the room would know the origin story of this training, how Captain Reynolds had publicly embarrassed a passenger who turned out to be the new VP of operations. It had become something of a legend within the airline, though the details had been mercifully blurred through the natural distortion of workplace gossip. As the room filled with attendees, James found himself thinking about the journey of the past 6 months. After returning to flight duty, he'd split his time between his regular captain responsibilities and working on this training initiative. At first, the dual role had been challenging. His fellow pilots had been curious, sometimes skeptical about his new project. Some had avoided him, perhaps fearing that his mistake might somehow be contagious. Others had been supportive, recognizing that any one of them could have had a similar lapse in judgment on a bad day. The training development itself had been more rewarding than James had expected. Working with Elena and the training department, he'd helped create a program that went beyond the usual corporate platitudes about customer service. They'd incorporated real-world examples, psychological insights about stress and assumption-making, and practical techniques for de-escalation and respectful communication. "Let's get started," Elena announced, bringing James back to the present moment. She stood at the front of the room, commanding attention without raising her voice, a skill James had come to admire. "Thank you all for coming today. We're here to introduce the new professional communication and conflict resolution program that will be rolled out company-wide next month." She gestured toward James. "Captain Reynolds has been instrumental in developing this initiative. I'll let him tell you about it himself." As James took his place at the podium, he felt a momentary flutter of nervousness. Public speaking had never bothered him before. As a captain, he was used to addressing passengers, but this was different. Today, he was not just presenting a training program. He was publicly acknowledging his own failure and what he'd learned from it. "Good morning," he began. 6 months ago, I made a serious mistake that many of you have probably heard about. I humiliated a passenger over the PA system based on assumptions that were completely wrong." He paused, making eye contact with several people in the room. That passenger turned out to be Dr. Martinez, but the truth is, it wouldn't have been acceptable regardless of who was sitting in that seat. The room was silent. Everyone's attention focused on James. I could have lost my job that day. Instead, I was given an opportunity to learn and to help create something that might prevent others from making similar mistakes. That's what we're presenting today. For the next hour, James and Elena took turns explaining the new program. They showed video clips of reenacted scenarios, demonstrated communication techniques, and outlined the structure of the training that would soon be required for all customer-facing staff. "What makes this program different," Elena explained, "is that it acknowledges the real pressures our employees face. We're not pretending that passengers are always right, or that our staff should be robots without feelings. Instead, we're providing practical tools for managing stress and maintaining professionalism even in difficult situations." James added, "We've also incorporated feedback from flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service representatives, the people who deal with these challenges every day. Their insights have been invaluable." As the presentation concluded, Robert Walsh stood up. "I've been with this airline for 27 years, and this is the most honest approach to customer service training I've ever seen. Instead of sweeping problems under the rug, we're learning from them. That takes courage, both institutional courage and personal courage." He looked directly at James. "Thank you for turning a negative incident into something that will benefit the entire company." The room broke into applause, and James felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. It wasn't pride exactly, but something more complex. A sense of having come through a difficult experience and created something worthwhile from it. After the presentation, as people mingled and discussed the program, Elena approached James with 2 cups of coffee. "So what's next for you?" she asked, handing him one of the cups. Now that the program is ready to launch, you'll be going back to full-time flying? James sipped his coffee, considering the question. Actually, I've been thinking about that. I've enjoyed the training development more than I expected. I'm wondering if there might be a way to stay involved, maybe as a part-time instructor. Elena smiled. Funny you should mention that. I was going to suggest something similar. We need experienced pilots who can speak honestly about the challenges of the job to make the training credible. Someone who's been there, made mistakes, and learned from them. Are you saying you want me to become the poster child for professional failures? James asked with a wry smile. I'm saying that authenticity is powerful, Elena replied. Your story resonates because it's real, and because you were willing to own your mistake and grow from it. James thought about how different things might have been if Elena had simply demanded his termination that day, as she would have had every right to do. Instead, her approach had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond one incident or one captain. Later that afternoon, James found himself in Elena's office, discussing the details of a new role that would allow him to continue flying, while also serving as a senior training consultant. As they finalized the arrangement, a thought occurred to him. You know, I've never properly thanked you, he said. Elena looked up from her computer. For what? For not firing me that day. For seeing potential where there could have just been punishment. She considered this for a moment. I believe in second chances when they're earned, and in finding value where others might see only problems. Besides, she added with a hint of a smile, the way you handled your bag wasn't exactly my finest moment either. We all have days when we're not at our best. James laughed, remembering how he'd misinterpreted her struggle with the injured wrist. We're quite a pair. The captain who jumped to conclusions and the VP who couldn't ask for help with her bag. And now we've turned that into a training program that's about to transform how an entire airline communicates. Elena stood and extended her hand. I think that's what they call making the best of a bad situation. As James shook her hand, he reflected on how differently things had turned out from what he'd feared 6 months ago. His mistake hadn't ended his career. Instead, it had expanded it in ways he couldn't have imagined. The following week, the airline's CEO formally announced the new training program at a press conference, with both Elena and James present. Industry publications picked up the story, praising Air National for its innovative approach to customer service training. What none of the articles mentioned, because few outside the airline knew, was that the program had been born from a moment of public humiliation, transformed into an opportunity for growth. 1 year to the day after their first disastrous encounter, James found himself on another Chicago to San Francisco flight. This time, Elena was seated in the cockpit jump seat as part of her ongoing operational review process. As they reached cruising altitude, she put on her headset. So, Captain Reynolds, she said with a smile in her voice, any passengers giving you trouble today? James chuckled as he adjusted the throttle. Not a one, VP Martinez, and if they do, I know exactly how to handle it, thanks to this excellent training program someone helped me develop. Below them, the patchwork landscape of America stretched out, a reminder of how far they'd both come from that day when an embarrassed passenger turned out to be so much more than anyone expected.